Okay, I think we're live. So hello, I am Simon, and I'm joined by Sonia, and we're probably going to do a fairly short review tonight. But we are going to be covering a few different bits and pieces. It's been a fairly big news week, starting with the fall of Assad, and probably talking about the capture of Luigi Mangione, and then moving on to a couple of other bits and pieces afterwards. So the first and biggest news, obviously, of the week has been the absolutely stunning defeat of Assad in Syria by a relatively surprising coalition of people who you wouldn't necessarily expect to get on, and the potential fallout from that. I mean, obviously, from an anarchist perspective, the grouping that we tend to pay most closest attention to is the Kurds, because they have, if not an anarchist position, but certainly a section of the of that kind of grouping has semi-anarchist inclinations. They have links to Öcalan and his post-Bookchin, not post-Bookchin, Bookchin, yeah,
You? Yes.
libertarian municipalism,
Great. Yes.
and yeah, so in terms of those politics, I suppose, and the threats to them, then obviously we have the issue of Turkey taking, and the possibility that it's now that it has what amounts to a client grouping as the most powerful faction in the putative new Syrian government. There is the threat from two sides potentially to the Kurds, and there are some reports coming through of tensions and even fighting that's been going on. We've spoken a little bit about this in kind of previous news reviews. I don't know, do you know do you have sort of much background reading around Öcalan and libertarian municipalism and how that kind of influences the Kurdish position in Syria and all this kind of stuff?
It's narrow, but what I think it's very interesting of all the whole situation is going to see how it develops when it comes to the dynamics between the groups, and especially because now, since thankfully at least the most Western countries have denied to be involved, just for once, and even Russia. But still, I mean, you were mentioning Turkey as a threat, right, for the Kurds in the north. But at the same time, we also have been seeing the attacks from Israel already in Damascus as well. So we have to see again how they're going to go to the so-called democratic change. That's what they wanted to do. They say now that perhaps there's going to be some kind of democratic election. We'll see how that goes, because as far as we know, under dictatorship, there has not been political parties. But of course, for us as anarchists, that's not our problem anyway. So when it comes to the Kurds, we have to see again how those dynamics are going to be developing, because the groups that actually have done all this, let's call it revolutionary takeover from or the fall of Assad, it seems like they are a very heterogeneous groups. That doesn't mean that when all this change to a more to get out of that dictature, we have to see how they're going to be cooperating farther. But it doesn't seem, of course, that this is going to go to imitate or to in the path that the Kurds and follow have been following, on even less a municipalist tendency. I don't think we we can expect that, but still, it can be interesting to see how this is going to develop. How much Turkey and Israel are going to be also getting involved or attacking at this point.
Yeah, I mean, there's always obviously the threat, and as we know from history, whenever there's serious pressure put on a polity by war and by sort of the loss of resources and the struggle for essentially getting armaments and all that kind of stuff, it can very much empower more authoritarian tendencies within a given movement, or at least make people desperate enough to turn to potential allies that can then misuse that trust and that power. I mean, obviously, in the Kurds' case, the natural and extremely dangerous people to turn to are the US, where, particularly, I think, expecting Trump to give much of a damn about the Kurds when he comes to power is probably a hiding into nothing. And it's very difficult to see where else they're going to be drawing support from, essentially. So, if the US does offer anything, it's going to be with so many strings attached that it may not even be worth the shouting. But I think one of the more encouraging things seems to be that there is at least dialogue happening between or at least some dialogue happening between the remnants of the old government, as the people who have thrown down their uniforms, the Syrian Democratic Forces, and HTS is the ex-Al Qaeda militia. How far that is PR, essentially, is very difficult to say. Because obviously, even with the Taliban, when they took over, there were a lot of noises about how they were a different Taliban to the Taliban that came before. And this was very much not the case once they had actually acquired power. So, yeah, how far any of this trust pans out, I suppose, is very much up in the air.
Mm.
But yeah, so moving on from that, I suppose the next one is to talk about is the capture of Luigi. I can never remember his second name. It's terrible. That young fella, anyway. Yeah, which has been an interesting one. I think one of the interesting things has been the confusion over his politics that has been going on, because he's kind of bounced all over the place in terms of what people have found out about him. He comes from a kind of a tech bro background from the sounds of things. He has a certain high regard for the Silicon Valley mogul types, which obviously draws from a sort of Randian objectivist perspective. But at the same time, he's clearly become more, certainly to the point where he shot someone, he's become much more of the opinion that CEOs are not necessarily the great titans of industry, creating wealth and all the rest of it. But I think so. So I was sort of saying this on the chat on the Freedom Signal chat that we have, that one of the things which seems to characterize him is something which is quite common among young men, sort of his age, sort of young to sort of early to mid 20s in particular, is they picked up, they very much magpie ideas, without going into a huge amount of depth with them. They sort of, he's listening to people like Peter Jordanson and Andrew Tate, and sort of being critical, but sort of taking their ideas on. He's listening to the likes of Joe Rogan. He's taking, but he's also taking on sort of infamously the Unabomber's manifesto, which is a much more sort of primitivist, direct actionist kind of approach, much as it has many reactionary views of its own. In turn, it's an interesting one, I think, to talk about in the ways in which people of his generation are not, they're clearly reaching it. They're clearly aware that something is wrong in society, and they're clearly but the things which get punted at them the whole time are all stemming from varying types of reactionary position. And they're not really coming across, by the time they come across left-wing views and anarchist views, they're already, we used to call it inoculation. I don't know whether it still is as a trade union term, where you preempt what the bosses are going to say, for example, and the tactics that they're going to use so that people feel comfortable in immediately dismissing and rebutting.
Yes, and I think it has been interesting as well. Number one, to see the reactions of people out there in social media, that a lot of understandably enough, knowing how the healthcare system is organized around the market and corporations in the US, of course, a lot of people thought that, this killing was, deserved. And of course, you can think that. At the same time, I agree with you, Simon. It's interesting to see how younger men are developing. At the time, it seems like this man was perhaps trying to look for answers, and somehow they end up in a pretty nihilist tendency. And what is interesting is that it might happen that he has read some anarchist works, but what it has really surprised me is that they always take this more destructive path, which is necessary. Call it self-defense. That's how we see it, right? Okay, they are really driven with doing extortion through the healthcare system, really killing people. That's what they do in very passive ways. That's what they are doing. So again, a lot of people thought that this was well-deserved because this is self-defense, right? One person did it, and now it's going to be symbolic, kind of. But at the same time, we know that there are many anarchist groups that are also working with self-defense, in the US, and they are working with alternatives, more direct action into building these mutual care networks, mutual care groups that actually are taking over and have been taking over for what the healthcare system is not doing, what the states and the federal government have not been doing historically, because it is not new. What we are seeing now is just a free market, ongoing. But this has been going on for decades. And this is actually worries me a little bit because, of course, deep down when you're in pain, and perhaps you even have family members that have been struggling and suffering because of this free market thinking and organizing of the healthcare system, I think that as anarchists, we have to think that both things are important to do. I mean, of course, historically, we have always stand for, self-defense, and if it's necessary to use some kind of, very kind of violence, a lot of anarchists might actually support that, which is, understandable. It is. That's how it is.
We have our insurrectionary thread.
Yes. If you're being systematically oppressed and attacked, at some point people react and we have to defend ourselves. That's fine. But at the same time, I would have loved that all these mutual care networks and groups that are working really, to fill the gaps and to support people on everyday basis get the same type of attention, right? The more the constructive part, the part that not because direct mutual aid is also direct action, right? But that of course is not, that doesn't give you the clickbait that is needed, like in this case. And I'm sure he didn't want. I don't know, by the way he seemingly organized this, it didn't seem like Luigi Mangione was after the recognition. We don't know. But in this case, I'm afraid that when people are not politically well attached or know enough to analyze the consequences of these actions, and they don't even have, it doesn't seem that he does have any group of people behind him. He doesn't have any collective behind him who can support this and take, the consequences of what he's going to do now. That's what worries me. What kind of examples are we setting? And from anarchist perspectives, I think we have to be really careful, because we know that this is going to take a toll, and we don't need a bunch of people. And unfortunately, we have to admit that it's mostly men who have been, who shoot around, not because they are men, but because also, it's very easy to get guns in the US. That's how it is. That's what they choose, really. We don't want that. We cannot be in a situation where people are just, shooting around and they claim self-defense. That's what they do. Mostly white men. That's have to be said as well. But then what's the political analysis behind them? What are the motivations, and what did he want to achieve? That's what I haven't seen still not answer to that. What kind of systemic change was he going to do shooting one person? The only system we have now is that we know that all the CEOs are gone from the internet. We don't know the names. That's actually a problem.
Yeah, I mean, there's a
We don't know who
certain,
they are.
yeah, I think there's a certain degree of embittered satisfaction that a lot of people are feeling
Yeah.
that, oh, CEOs are a bit scared that just for once. And like I absolutely get that. But like Alexander Berkman, go back into the old greybeards. Alexander Berkman famously attempted to kill Henry Clay Frick as an attentat as part of like a major industrial dispute, and this was, in his view, an attempt to uh, engage with, essentially try and win the dispute through attentat or assassination, political
Yeah.
assassination. But when he sort of reflected on it, what he found was that what it did was delegitimize the struggle that was taking place and unify the ruling class around its destruction. And ultimately, he didn't feel that what he did was a worthwhile action because it was an individual's action, and even the miners themselves were not in favor. The workers themselves were not in favor of what he did. He'd done it without their say so and their approval. And all direct action needs to be grounded in mass movements. Otherwise, it's, as you say, what is it for? What does it achieve? Look, assassinations. There is a grand history of necessary assassinations. Anyone who says that an assassination has never been useful or never saved lives is kidding themselves. But yeah, like these kind of atomized, individualized actions they're cries in the night. They're not going, nothing is going to change in the next week or the next month about the US healthcare system as a result of one CEO getting shot. And as you say, the CEOs themselves will probably just make themselves more difficult to get hold of and even more. I mean, even as it is, the average CEO is removed. I mean, I couldn't tell you the names of the FTSE 100 CEOs, let alone the senior directors around them. And these are some of the most powerful people in the world, right? But yeah, like there's no, as Corporate Watch used to say, these people have names and they have addresses.
They do. But
But
hopefully, what my hope is that after this shooting, after this assassination, that people are going to start these kind of conversations. I think
yeah,
locally with their closer groups and collectives, because that's what we need. We need that people are again asking the background and what do we want to achieve. I mean, the famous means and ends in anarchism, right? What do we want to achieve? Yes, we want to, of course, defeat capitalism. Wonderful, but how are we going to get there? And it seems that right now, again, this is like what can you say, like fresh air. Yeah, suddenly one less CEO. Yeah, I mean, wonderful, but we have a bunch of them still, doing the same work. They are going to be afraid for a while, but they are still going to continue doing it. So I think that actually the questions you're asking, Simon, hopefully the viewers are going to be taking them over and lifting them up locally and say, okay, what else can we do otherwise?
yeah. On the subject of solidarity, we have one, probably because I think you probably need to go fairly soon. So we've got the failure to prosecute landlords is a very solid story in Freedom this week. And it's specifically talking about 115 local councils haven't prosecuted a single landlord in 5 years. And it kind of goes into the detail and sort of talks a little bit about how there's a crossover of landlords and councillors in most people will be well aware across most councils there will be a large number of people who are themselves landlords, and they tend to sew up the policy making around landlords and renters' rights. And it has led to effectively a degree of impunity for the landlord class, regardless of what the actual laws are. Labour is famously bringing in what is supposed to be a tougher set of laws in the next while, following on from the Tories trying and notably failing to do the same thing. So one of the things I was interested to ask you was about your experiences in other countries of kind of similar issues, essentially, and how they play out.
Yes, well, we have, of course, unfortunately, very similar situations. And for instance, if we can talk a little bit about the situation in Spain and in Norway, it's the two contexts that I know a little bit better. In Spain, since 2009, we have had a group that they are locally organized, but it's in the whole country, that it's the platform for people against, the bank loans when it comes to, the living situation. Because in Spain, what is interesting is, again, that it's a lot of funds, international funds, that since the economic breakdown, or the what do they call it, the bubble we had in 2008, where the whole market for houses, the housing market, just exploded, for the worst, of course. It made that a lot of funds bought up a lot of houses and buildings, and now the last 2 decades, this platform of people, locally groups, have been trying to stop evictions, and they are trying to reach a little bit more of a fair living situation for tenants and otherwise. In Spain, the problem is that the corruption that you're talking about, that the connections between politicians being landlords and rich people being landlords, it's absolutely there, unfortunately. And the problem is, again, that since we in Spain we have so much mass tourism, that's also perhaps a little bit different. It's my guess when it comes to the situation in England, and it's because, again, it's funds and banks being landlords, and that makes it extremely difficult for people, again, to fight for their rights as well, because it's a little bit of a parallel with the healthcare systems and CEOs. You don't know who they are. You don't have a face. You don't have a person to deal with. You have a whole corporation. So in Spain, apart from trying to stop evictions, of course, and getting people, to become homeless, we know also that in the last 15 years, we had an increasement, thankfully, of occupations. And most of them, it's almost 25% more, but most of them are families. Actually, usually when you talk about occupations, a lot of people can see for themselves a little bit, a younger generation with a certain aesthetic and so on. But actually in Spain, one of the things that people know, that they don't prosecute landlords when you have both politicians and people in the legal system, and everybody's connected. What people do then is they occupy. That's what has been happening. So because in Spain, I think people have lost their faith, rightfully so, on the legal system. So they are not. We know that they are not going to prosecute anybody. While here in Norway, 5 years ago or so, some students in the city of Oslo started something similar, but it's because it has become really, really expensive. I mean, everybody knows Norway is expensive, but Oslo is even, it's worse. So a group of students actually started a campaign to demand, of course, a regulation of the prices for rent, but there's been no prosecution at all, and there's no regulation either. So that means that rich people can own all the buildings they want or all the apartments they want, and I have not seen either prosecutions here of landlords. So again, I think the situation is pretty much alike. All landlords everywhere here in Europe are living safely, because nobody's going to prosecute them. Why would they? So it's actually pretty similar, but I think that, of course, people mobilize differently. you know.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting sort of listening to the similarities and differences because the sort of what you were saying about the big fund buy up post 2008 is obviously in certainly in the US and to a lesser degree in the UK, I think. That buy up, except that buy up sort of similarly happening, but not to the same degree. But then in the directly post-COVID period, particularly in the US, there was a massive buy up, a sort of a lot of huge funds sinking their money into property because it's safe to a great degree,
Yeah.
and immediately sort of pushing prices of houses up. Um, but I think the UK probably has more, it sounds like it has more in common with Norway at the moment than it does with Spain, at least in also in part because I think it doesn't have uh, the vibrancy in the squatting movement, for example. And there's a lot of historic factors for that. The most damaging was a piece of legislation which made it made you criminally liable for residential squatting, which I think scared an awful lot of people off, particularly because it was done in conjunction with a switch from landlords having to evict their own places to the cops basically being like, right, cool, we can smash our way in, um, which meant that you had to be relatively hardcore and prepared to move around a lot,
Yeah.
which is the sort of thing which families can't really afford to do to the same extent. So it kind of pushed people out of that mode of doing. I mean, there is still family squatting that happens, but I think the market has been much more comprehensively sewn up in the UK. There's sort of in the article it mentions a couple of sort of decent things which are happening on that level. And you've got kind of Acorn and Living Rent, which are increasingly starting to move or starting to regenerate because they used to be a very powerful renters movement in the UK, and it kind of fell apart. But it's quite encouraging to see these groups getting involved in stuff. Right, so I think we are probably running low on time. We are hitting just about 8 p.m. So I will probably have to wave you off, and then I shall be monologuing for 5 minutes, and then I'll
It will be a
say goodbye
very
for
nice
Christmas.
monologue, Simon. So good luck.
Thanks very much. Lovely to see you, and Merry Christmas or festivities
Likewise.
of any kind.
Merry
Um,
Christmas.
and I shall see you again later. Uh, Cool. So for said monologue, I'm going to keep it brief, in as much as this is just to say this is the last of the news reviews for this year, and we should be picking it back up in January. Um, in terms of what things that Freedom have got coming up, so you may have seen this book behind me. This is the latest book from Freedom Press. You can find it on our website. Um, and we are hopefully going to be doing a bit more in the way of talks around the book and kind of talking about the implications of anarchist organizing and mutual aid around COVID and that period of time, and how we did it, what we got wrong, how the state reacted, and the ways in which disruptive influences got involved, the ways in which the general public sort of took to mutual aid and sort of engaged with anarchist praxis. I mean, one of the interesting things that came up today, in fact, was there's a YouGov poll of how popular different creeds are, different ideologies are, and we were the lowest, directly above fascism. We were the lowest, even more unpopular than communism, which, given communism's history of mass murder, is quite something. Um, but it's a really strong indication that you can take anarchist ideas like mutual aid, like non-hierarchical organizing, and present them to people, and people will run with it. People are quite used to these ideas. They're quite used to working with these premises. Um, but call it anarchism, and the recognition is only of anarchism, presumably, as a destructive, burn things down kind of force. When we're talking about a little earlier about attentats and anarchism as a combative approach, and it certainly has those elements, but clearly, what the general public thinks of as anarchism doesn't take our commitment to mutual aid into account. So, um, when talking about our engagement with COVID, I think it's an important thing to do because it's one of these examples of us acting in practice in modern times, not just in sort of 1936 or whatever. So that's one to be keeping an eye out for. And right on the other end of the spectrum, we will hopefully, in the new year, fingers crossed, they are at the printers as we speak, bringing out a new edition of Physical Resistance, which is a book by Dave Hahn, and which has been expanded and updated by Louise Perbrick. This is talking about 100 years of direct action anti-fascism. It's not just about anarchists, because obviously we weren't the only ones involved, but it has a broadly anarchist perspective and a working class centric perspective on the ways in which we fought back from all the way back from the roots of fascism in Britain to today. So that is also going to be that's going to be coming out. Louise is going to be doing a talk on it, and we will keep you updated on that probably in a New Year's newsletter or something. So keep an eye out. Merry Christmas to everybody, and indeed happy holidays and festivities wherever you are.